Chapter 10. Three silent men rode back over the dusty trail to Dutch Springs. The sheriff mulled over the events of the day. Ezra sulked over the sandy. The alert bandit had run over him. Sam mused on the reward money that had seemed so close but now so far away. Pat was not the only one with a plaster on his spread. Nels Larson figured in the sheriff's mind. Pat knew Nels from before. The ex-bronc buster was tough and tricky, with no more respect for the law than the law could enforce on a six-gun. Rumor had it that he had drifted down to Arizona after the fracas with his wife, but news of easy pickings in Powder Valley may have lured him back. Cheyenne Charlie had been one of his old cronies. The loot was cached at his ranch, and his ponies were used to tote it away. Pat remembered the stink of fresh dung in the horse barn. That barn had seen plenty of use as of late. Every sign shouted Nels and looked like he was linked up with LaRoe, but dang it, the sheriff's lips twisted with annoyance. There was not one concrete piece of evidence that would justify a warrant for the arrest of the boss of the Circle L. The sole clue the train wreck had yielded was the flour sack mass that Ezra had picked up on the prairie, a sack to whom traces of a fragrant scent still clung. Sam and Ezra pulled off at the Gold Eagle to wash the trail dust out of their throats. There were weightier matters on Pat's mind. He headed for the livery. Two burros stood outside the pie shop, laden with dun sacks. Bent over double, a portly Mexican toted them through the low-hung door. June was particular about her flour. From the day of opening, the stout Jose had packed it in from his small mill near Hopewell. The perspirating Jose grunted an affable "Buenas noches," and Pat nodded and wheeled into the livery. His pony watered and grained, he hit for the lean-to office. Sunk in his swivel chair, feet crooked on spur-scratched desk, the sheriff built a smoke and considered the case with a worried brow. 2 hold-ups, a murder, a train crew smashed up, and no arrests. It didn't sit very well. For a while he pondered, and then came to a decision. He slapped at the sweaty Stinson and emerged from the office, and hit for the bucket of blood with purposeful steps. There were more loiterers outside LaRoe's joint than patrons inside. The plank walks were clustered with construction laborers, moodily clustered around the doorways of the brightly lit saloons, disgustedly spit out of the drifting dust, but not $1 in their jeans to buy a drink. The sheriff sighted Maggie Maloney, sitting with a bored group of girls at a table in the rear of the bucket of blood. The knots of poker players and sprinkling of men along the bar seemed lost in the vast timber and canvas structure. Maggie rose at his approach. "Look, girls," she cried. "A cash customer. I saw him first." Scarlet lips parted in a smile. With a devilment dancing in her dark eyes, she advanced to meet him. "Well, she's a fine-looking figure of a gal," thought Pat, in an unwilling admiration. Well, if she'd washed that paint off, that is. "It's nice to see you again, Sheriff." Maggie's voice was softly caressing. "I know you're just itching to buy me a drink." "LaRoe in his office," put out the sheriff shortly. "Don't tell me you called just to see him." Her eyes were mocking. "He's over at the barber's." "Well, that's husky-dory. Let's me and you have a little powwow." He grasped her white arm and steered her towards the office. She waved her free arm gaily towards the short-skirted rogue group at the table. "I got me a man, girls." But Pat felt her muscles tense. He kicked the door shut behind him and nodded curtly towards the empty chair behind the desk. "Sit down, ma'am." Maggie glanced at him sharply, then rounded the table and gracefully sank into the chair. "What's this, a new technique?" she inquired lazily, stretching her slim arms. The sheriff sat on the table's edge and stared down at her silently. "Well?" There was an edge on her voice. "I was just trying to figure you as a train wrecker." "Say, how many drinks have you had?" "Listen, lady," returned Pat stonily. "There were 4 hombres in that gang. One had small feet." He stretched forward and glanced beside the table at her shapely instep and high-heeled shoes. "Just about as small as yours. She broke away from the gang and headed for town. She dropped her mask, a white flour sack with slits. It was a clear giveaway because the scent she'd used stuck to it. That scent was odeur d'amour. I guess that's what you called it. Not another gal uses it in town. Ain't that a fact?" Maggie Maloney was sober enough now. Questioning, her dark eyes met his. "Is this a shakedown, or are you crazy?" she demanded. "Sniff this." Pat yanked a crumpled flour sack out of the pocket and dropped it on the table. Maggie picked it up and held it beneath her nose. "Well?" "It is my scent," she admitted coolly. "And how'd it get on that sack?" Maggie shrugged her white shoulders indifferently. "How should I know?" "Well, see here, Maggie," grated the sheriff. "You can't bluff out of this. You come clean and I'll give you 2 hours to leave town. If you dumb up, you go into jail, charged with hold-up and conspiracy to murder, and that means a life stretch." The dance hall girl rose to her feet, eyes blazing. "She's game," thought Pat. "You can't railroad me, you dumb ox," she raged. "I was never out of the saloon when that pay train was wrecked. Get out of here before I have LaRoe throw you out." "And you can prove your alibi by LaRoe, Silky, and a bunch of floozies who combines oath ain't worth a dead cigar butt," derided Pat. "You come along with me." He slid off the table's edge and took a quick pace towards the defiant Maggie. "LaRoe, Silky!" Her shrill shriek filled the room. "Come quick!" Small fists clenched. She hammered the sheriff's face and chest as he crowded her against the wall. Outside he heard the scuffle of feet on sanded floor. He grabbed the girl, threw his left arm around her and pinned her arms down. The door flew open and LaRoe burst in, and Silky Shelby was at his heels. Behind them, pattering a flock of chattering dance hall girls. With his free hand, Pat jerked the gun out of his holster and cocked it with one swift motion. LaRoe's right hand dove swiftly beneath his black coat. Silky slid to the side of the room, and the girls packed the doorway. "Pull that hideaway gun," snapped the sheriff, "and I'll be dropping you." His level gun swiveled. "Silky, get back to the door." LaRoe froze, hand beneath his armpit, expressionless as usual. Silky Shelby came to a halt. "What's the trouble, Maggie?" he whispered. "This big goof claims I helped hold up the pay train," she shrilled. "You picked up the wrong hand, Sheriff," said Silky softly. "That's for me to say," returned Pat crisply. A barkeep broke through the press of girls grasping a sawed-off shotgun. At sight of Maggie, held tight against Pat, the sheriff's circling gun, he came to a quick stop and stared around in a pop-eyed bewilderment. Silky spoke again, his whispering voice playing in the brittle silence. "Better throw in your hand, Sheriff. You can't get out of here with Maggie." "She's going all right," Pat assured him grimly. He had noted a door to his left that gave exit to the rear of the saloon. Arm firmly locked around Maggie's twisting form, he scuffled slowly sideways towards it, dragging her with him. LaRoe had not spoken, but the sheriff saw a quick glint in his eyes that foreshadowed action. Shelby had been sliding backwards. He whispered to the white-aproned barkeep. Pat, gun held on the row, saw the short barrel of the shotgun edge up. Hell, he thought, swiftly calculating his chances. That dumb gink will blast the pair of us into shreds, and if I down him, LaRoe will get me.
"Drop that gun, Johnny!" shrieked Maggie frantically. "Cut it out! You'll make mincemeat out of me, too! Stop him, LaRoe!"
LaRoe swung around and wrenched the gun out of the barkeep's hands. Pat had reached the door now. It was latched. With one hand he held the gun, with the other Maggie. She grasped his predicament.
"Loose me,"
she urged in husky undertone.
"There'll be blue murder if we don't get out of here."
His grasp relaxed, and he felt her arm go under and back, and the fingers fumbling for the doorknob. The door swung open outward, and a cool breeze welled in. His opponents stood irresolute, held back only by the threat of his pointing gun. He could see LaRoe's long fingers twitching. Quickly he stepped outside and kicked the door shut. Maggie released her breath in a sigh of relief.
"Gee,"
her husky voice shook.
"Johnny's dumb enough to let fly with both barrels of that shotgun."
The sheriff became aware that his shirt was sticking to his back. He suddenly felt foolish, standing in the dark, tightly embracing Maggie. His arm slackened about the girl's waist, and he shifted his grip to her arm. Impatiently, she wrenched free.
"You don't have to maul me,"
she added vindictively.
"I wouldn't be wearing your pants for $1 million when the boys get wise to this."
Pat wanted no more trouble with Maggie. To avoid contact with the construction hands who idled thick upon the plank walks, he conducted her down to the rear of the store and tents that fronted Main Street. In tight-lipped silence, Maggie stumbled through a litter of empty cans and discarded bottles in her high-heel shoes. Sam and Ezra were tranquility smoking in the office. At sight of the bare-armed girl in low-cut evening dress and dark hair pyramided high, their jaws dropped. "Give me the keys to the cooler," requested Pat behind the scornful Maggie.
"You're not jailing her, are you?"
gasped Sam. "Just watch me," said Pat coolly. Due to the dearth of ready money in Dutch Springs, the jail lacked its customary quota of drunks. 2 Mexicans picked up in a knifing fray, and an Irishman, who had crowned a barkeep with a bottle, were the sole inmates. In wondering silence, they watched the sheriff unlock the door of an empty cell and usher the girl inside. Maggie had not spoken a word since she had left the vicinity of the bucket of blood. "I'll tote some blankets over later," said the sheriff gruffly, as he clicked the door behind her. He hated to jail a woman, but 2 men had been killed in the Coyote Cut wreck, and the lingering odor of Maggie's scent on the mask was plain proof that she was implicated. Blondie had confessed her part in the affray, and so had Maggie, he assured himself after a night in the cell. Pat read the question in his partner's eyes when he irritably jerked open the desk drawer and dropped the keys inside. "Well, we got one hold-up artist," he commented. "Not that gal." Sam's voice reflected his disbelief. "Ever see a prettier sight than a wildcat till it shows its teeth?" boomed Ezra. "You hit it, Ezra." Pat dropped the creased, folded flour sack on the desk. "That's what jugged Maggie." He told of the dance hall girl's exclusive scent, sent especially from New York for her use. But Sam, bewildered as a terrier, was obdurate.
Women just don't go wrecked in trains. It ain't their nature, he objected.
Betcha to the 2 cartwheels you owe me she spills her guts come sunup, challenged Ezra.
Well, that's a bet, snapped Sam.
Bill North brought the first hint of impending trouble. The tall young railroader, now paymaster down at the yard, hustled into the sheriff's office an hour later. You better fort up, he warned tightly. There's trouble brewing at the Bucket of Blood. The row's thrown the joint wide open, free whiskey for all. The place is packed to the doors. Right now they're passing out bottles to the overflow on the plank walks, and they're damning you, Sheriff, as the biggest skunk ever created. Maggie's the belle of Bucket of Blood. When those construction hands get all liquored up, they're liable to tear the town apart. Before he finished his recital, Jake Pierce's stocky form filled the doorway. You sure make a martyr of Maggie, he told Pat. The idea of LaRoe's passion flower enduring martyrdom evidently tickled him, for his ruddy features crinkled in the gust of silent laughter. You better hustle the gal out of town before trouble breaks. The sheriff shook his head. We'd never get out of town now. Best I can do is gather a bunch of deputies and ride herd on the jail. He dispatched Sam and Ezra to round up every dependable citizen who could be deputized, and then slipped into the night himself. At first sight, it seemed that Main Street was deserted. The plank walks were empty. As if realizing the futility of his vocal efforts, a barker leaned against the front of a saloon smoking a cigar. A few wayfarers brushed past Pat, evidently heading somewhere in a hurry. The mystery was solved when the sheriff neared the Bucket of Blood. A deep rumbling roar throbbed from within its blank walls. North had not exaggerated. When Pat surveyed the saloon from the shadows of the opposite plank walk, he saw that it was packed to the door. A torrent of sound poured from the seething mob of construction laborers that filled up the row's free whiskey, drunken shouts and hoarse threats and ribald song. Beneath the flaming lamps at the entrance, men were clustered like swarming bees, striving to enter the crowded hive. 2 barkeeps elbowed through the press, a case of whiskey slung between them. Before they reached the plank walk, it was wrestled from them, and 100 thirsty men fought for the bottles. The drought in Dutch Springs had ended, but, thought Pat bitterly, LaRoe was not emptying his cellar out of pity for the dollar-starved railroaders. There was a sinister motive behind his lavish generosity, and the motive was only too plain. A dozen or more deputies, all old-timers, packed the little lean-to when the sheriff re-entered his office. Each was armed with a shotgun or a Winchester. Briefly, Pat warned them of the expected trouble, and posted a lookout round the jail, and held the remainder in reserve. For a while, all was quiet. The office filled with smoke as men puffed with pipes and cigarettes, hunkered down around the walls. And then pandemonium broke loose down Main Street. A trouble-hunting mob poured from the Bucket of Blood, with but one aim in their muddled minds, to free Maggie Maloney. Pat hustled his reserve force outside and doubled the circle of armed men around the adobe jail. Standing in the darkness, he listened to the hullabaloo that heralded the approach of the mob. Shouting, singing, and cursing, they surged down Main Street, flooded the plank walks, and scuffled wild-eyed through the thick dust of the street. A premonition of defeat chilled the sheriff. Before this mob, his little band of deputies would be swept away like chips on a raging current. Resistance was futile. Why attempt to fight a hopeless battle? Free Maggie. The moment of weakness passed. He had sworn to enforce the law. Maggie Maloney had helped hold up the pay train. Her place was behind the bars. Mob or no mob, he'd hold her for trial. A ragged, yelling column, the throng streamed along both sides of the courthouse and converged upon the little jail at its rear. In the gloom, Pat watched the shadowy mass of men closing in around the line of guards. The sheriff drew his 6-gun, pointed it skyward, and fired. Sudden silence draped the mob, an ominous silence, like the tense calm that precedes a violent storm. Pat's shouted warning broke the quiet. "Don't let Leroux fool you, fellers. Maggie helped grab your own coin. She's in the jail and she'll be staying there." A concerted roar broke his eardrums and drowned his voice. A guard's gun crashed. In thundering reply, a dozen guns flashed from the mob. The roar of explosions mingled with the tinkle of glass as the windows of the office splintered. Around the sheriff, the night became alive with dim, hurtling forms. Before he could thumb back the hammer of his gun, a flailing fist took him on the side of the head and he sprawled headlong. End of chapter 10.